Has taken the microphone off the DJ stand and clipped it to the front of his baby blue jacket. He's free to walk around now, and he does, slowly, circling the folding chairs. We can all hear his voice because of the microphone, but we have to keep turning around to see where he is. He says, Lot's wife had her chance to get away from Sodom, but she went and turned around even when she'd been told not to. All she had to do was keep walking and not look back at her friends and neighbors as they were getting rained on by fire. But then she did, and so she got changed into a pillar of salt. I have never seen salt in pillar form, and I'm not sure what it would look like. I don't know if she was still shaped like herself, or if she just turned into a big pile of salt that you would never know used to be a person. It's scary to think of something like that could happen to you, just not for listening to directions. He moves to the center of the rink, directly under the disco ball, shaking his head. All this insanity that you see in the papers, the declining moral values of today, this is all part of the prophecy. If you watch the news, you can see it all unraveling before you. Deadly wars are brewing in Lebanon. The children of Israel are back in their homeland, and the stage is set for the final scene. He looks out the window again at the cars on the highway. But Lot survived the fire and brimstone, he says, quiet again, almost whispering. And Noah survived the flood. And just by being in this room, just by staying true to Scripture, we've built ourselves an ark, haven't we? Haven't we? We have, Pastor, we have. Yes, we have. So you have nothing to fear. Scripture tells us that when the storm comes, only the faithful will be ushered through the wind and rain to live in perfect salvation. Like Noah, we will be chosen not to suffer because we, in our lives, have chosen to live rightly. Noah and the ark is a difficult story to imagine. All that water coming out of nowhere, then disappearing just as fast. Last year, the Kaw River flooded its banks, and when the water finally went down, the news showed dead cows lying in muddy pastures, their stomachs bloated, flies buzzing around their heads. The people who had to move the cows were wearing handkerchiefs over their noses and mouths, and even the reporter kept one held up to his face when he wasn't talking. It must have smelled like that when Noah's flood went down too, but worse, because there would have not just been cows, but people too, lots of them. Even the rainbow in the sky, when Noah first came out of the ark and looked around, things would have been pretty gross. Everybody else drowned? I asked Eileen. We are in the car going home. At the end of the service, Pastor Dave gave me a Bible with green gold letters. I hold it carefully in my lap, feeling its weight. She nods. Everybody who wasn't on the ark, but they got to bring 2 of each kind of animal. That's why we still have animals today. We pass a field along the highway where the horses are grazing, 3 brown horses and 1 gray. There is grass inside the fence, but all 4 of them lean their long necks over it to get at the tall grass on the other side. Only 2 horses? Yes, a boy horse and a girl horse, sweetie. 2 of each kind? She runs her tongue along the bad side of her mouth. Well, there weren't as many different kinds of horses back then, only when people started breeding them. And polar bears? She nods again. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if she's listening. She's thinking about the baby. Did they bring ice and snow for them so they wouldn't get too hot? Mm-hmm. 2 dogs? Yep. All the different kinds of dogs, St. Bernards with their poodles? Yes. They were in cages? She pauses just for a moment. Yes. Things like tarantulas, mice, rats? Yes, honey, 2 of everything except the fish. The flood didn't bother them one bit. Grasshoppers? Yes. I squint, looking out the window. Wouldn't the tarantulas need to eat the grasshoppers? What would the tigers eat? She scratches her head. They probably brought extra of stuff like that. I picture Noah walking around with his staff and sandals, trying to organize the whole mess, giving orders, ducks quacking, kangaroos jumping around. How did Noah know which tarantulas were boys and which were girls? Eileen lights a cigarette and rolls down her window. God knew, honey. And all the other animals died? Mm-hmm. She looks in the rearview mirror. He had to show he meant business, give the world a good cleaning. She takes one hand off the steering wheel and makes tiny scrubbing motions. My mother took me to see Black Beauty last year, and I cried during the part where the old horse is whipped because it can't pull fast enough anymore. But the true stories are always the worst, and this one about Noah is really terrible. All the horses in the world getting killed except just the lucky 2. I picture thousands of them trying to swim, frantic and kicking, the water rising up over their ears. I imagine myself standing next to Noah, before the rain came, me wearing my normal clothes, looking at a field of horses, all of them staring up at me with their lovely horse eyes. Old horses with swaybacks, skinny colts, the rain already starting to fall. 2, Evelyn, Noah would say. You can only pick 2. But how could anyone pick 2 out of so many? No matter which 2 I chose, I would be killing all the others. There would be no way to choose the best 2 because all horses are good. You would just have to close your eyes and point. And finally, doors would have to be shut, sealed off, even when the other people came knocking and then pounding, dogs, even puppies, scratching on the wood. Let us in, let us in. But you would have to just close your ears to them and not open the door, because if you did, the ark would sink under the weight of everyone in the world, and there would be no one left at all.
That's good.
Thank you. Well, I could see if anybody has questions. Give you a minute to think. I'll read that shit. Yes.
What's your? It's kind of 2 parts. What's it like for you personally to have a book picked for Common Core? What's your personal experience with that? And then I'd be interested in what you think of the Common Core itself, about that phenomenon in this campus of the last few years.
So Dr. Daly asked me, what's it like to have your book picked for Common Core, and what is my experience with Common Core book?
Yeah.
You know, I don't know yet. This is kind of my first event. I kind of understand that something's coming, you know? And it'll be strange. I mean, I got more publicity for my most recent book. You know, I went on the big book tour, and there was a lot of publicity around that, and so that was sort of a big adjustment. But this will be interesting because this is my community where I work and where I live. And you know, some of my students will be reading it. I am under the impression that the honor students, I teach mostly, when I do teach undergraduate classes, I teach mostly honor students, and they do read the common book. And so it's going to be strange having my students. What I usually get from my students is, my mom reads your books. My grandmother read your book. I got both of those yesterday, you know? But I don't know that too many of them read my books. And so this will be interesting to have students reading my book, you know? And
a lot of them.
A lot of them, yeah. They're going to give out 5,000 copies, and they're going to do a bunch. I mean, right now I'm taking part in the, you know, as a participant in the Read Across Lawrence. So, you know, I read Housekeeping, and we went to the movie last night that was free at Woodruff, you know, and I'm going to go to some of the talks, and I'm going to go to Marilyn Robinson's reading. And I think it's great that it's this community event, and we're all reading the same book and thinking about it, and, you know, the spin-off discussions. I do think they chose this one because Evelyn is so interested in science. So things at the Natural History Museum will be interesting. Of course, you know, there's political science, there's history, and so there's a lot of overlapping interests for faculty and students in different fields, and obviously social work, psychology, gender studies, so much of that kind of stuff. So I'm just kind of excited to see the conversations that unfold in a university setting. I've never had that done. So I've gone on book tours, I've done all that, but this will be different. And it's really, really interesting to me as a writer. You know, it's kind of your dream to have your work discussed and considered by so many people in a community like this.
Right.
Yes?
What direction is your writing taking now?
He asked me what direction my writing is taken now. On my 4th book, my most recent book, my first 3 novels were contemporary, if you call this one contemporary. I mean, it's set in the 80s, but I was alive. But with my 4th book, you know, when I first got to KU and they let me teach, you know, they had me teach creative writing classes, but they also let me teach a lit course. So I got to design any lit course I wanted for my honors freshman. And I thought, oh, I'll teach historical heroines. And so we did Gone with the Wind and Beloved, and we did Snowflower and the Secret Fan and Atonement and The Reader. And then the next semester I taught historical villains, and we did Lolita and The Talented Mr. Ripley, Richard III, Doubt, some other, you know. And I just love historical fiction. I love reading it. But I was always intimidated to try it because it's you have to do all the plot and characterization and setting. You have to do all that, but then you have to do it with every detail that you don't know that you have to look up and research so you get it right. So, you know, every time a character turns on a light, you got to think about what kind of light is it? You know, you can't just go with your vague associations from watching TV shows that may or may not have really done their research. And so I really had to think about this. So I was intimidated by it, but I love the way historical fiction reminds me that this time period, too, is just a blip in time, and that the values that we have now aren't necessarily permanent or what's true and real. And that's why I like them, and also just the idea of being able to time travel about all being invisible, and safe, protected. Like, I love reading about the past, but I have no interest in living in the past unless I could be invisible and heavily loaded with antibiotics. I don't I'm nostalgic for it. But then I came across this historical fact that I thought, oh, that would make such a good novel. And it intrigued me so much that I did write this historical, my most recent novel, The Chaperone, which is primarily set in 1922. And I did have to do a lot of research for it, and it was a lot of work, but it was pretty intriguing to me. And so I think the next one, too, is going to be historical. So I don't know if every book I write from now on will be historical. I like to think I can go back and forth. I hope I can. But it seems like I'm going in more of a historical direction. Although I think I have similar themes still.
So to what extent does your social work background inform your writing?
My social work, he asked how much my social work background informs my writing. I think it's always there. I think it's in every book, including the historical ones. For a while when I started to take those creative writing courses and I was so behind everyone else, I wished that I had majored in creative writing or English because I hadn't read as much and I felt like everybody knew stuff I didn't know. But I slowly realized like I kind of knew stuff that other people maybe didn't know, and I could bring that sensibility in. There is a lot of overlap with social work and writing because when I was in school, all my professors really emphasized empathy. And empathy is so important with writing, and it's so important in social work. Not closing a character off and saying that's the end, and the snap like a cheap block ending, but understanding that endings might be long and drawn out and surprising. I got that from social work, so it's still with me. I think the experiences from working in the field, I was only in the field for 3 or 4 years, but it teaches you a lot, and it also teaches you a lot about your own limitations. So I think that's how it does.
Laura, would you refresh my mind, the name of your 2 first books?
Yeah.
What?
Okay, my first book is this one,
Yes.
The Center of Everything. I'm sorry, it's The Center of Everything.
I have read that one.
Oh, yeah?
I enjoyed that,
Right.
yeah.
And it's the common book for this coming year, and I'm really excited about what's going to happen. I know they're going to have some event at the Science Museum because that becomes, she actually walks down Jayhawk Boulevard at one point in the book. So I hope that'll be neat for people. And then my second book is The Rest of Her Life, which came out in 2007.
What?
It's called The Rest of Her Life.
The Rest of Her Life.
And that's a contemporary novel that is set, I was sort of imagining Hayes when I wrote it. It's a college town, but it's a real isolated college town. And it's a pretty sad book. It's my least popular book because the narrator is sort of, has been described as prickly. She kind of grew up hardscrabble, but pulled herself up by her bootstraps and is now a high school teacher in this small town in western Kansas. And she's married to a college professor. And they have 2 children, and the boy sort of struggles socially, as the mother did, and so the mother and the son have this connection. But the daughter is this sort of golden girl. She's beautiful, she's obviously, of a different social class, socioeconomic class, and she's just socially skilled, and it just seems like everything comes so easily to her that there's kind of this underlying tension between them. I was thinking of that adage, when I was a child, we had to go uphill both ways, and so the mother underlying, she loves her daughter, but she has this underlying sense of not resentment, but just distance as far as how much she can understand or empathize with her daughter. And then her daughter accidentally kills someone driving, and the relationship is pushed to the limit in a new way. And the victim is someone from a lower socioeconomic class, the daughter of a single parent. So it's certainly not a happy book, but I don't try and write books that are just going to depress people. I do try to think about, because if you want to do that, you can just read the paper. So I do try to think about where they could go plausibly that might be in a meaningful direction. So that's something I tried. And then my third book, the protagonist is 20, and she is a junior at KU, pre-med, and her parents live in Kansas City, and they are going through a very nasty divorce, really, really nasty. And she is trying to make her own decisions about her future while her mother is sort of free-falling into poverty post-divorce. And then this fourth book, The Chaperone, the historical one, is I learned, I don't know if you all know who Louise Brooks is. She's the flapper. She's beautiful. She, you would know her if you saw a picture of her. She had the black page boy with the straight bangs, big dark eyes. And she was actually born in Kansas in 1906 and then moved to Wichita when she was 9 years old. And then she left for New York as a teenager. And I came across her information when I was reading a book about flappers, and the guy who wrote the book was writing, about Zelda Fitzgerald and Clara Bow and Colleen Moore, and he was saying, oh, they were all kind of supposed to be wild child, but Louise Brooks was the real deal. She was the true rebel, the real one who just didn't care what people thought. And I was so intrigued that she was from Kansas, and then I read when she was 15 years old, she left for New York to quickly become a movie star, but she was in the company of a 36-year-old housewife from Wichita.
Yeah.
And there's very little known about this woman because at the end of the summer, the chaperone returned to Wichita and lived out the rest of her life in anonymity, whereas Louise skyrocketed to fame. And I was reading Louise Brooks' memoirs that she wrote in her 80s, and at the end of her life, when she was recollecting that summer, she said, I tolerated my chaperone's provincialism because we shared a love of theater. And I thought, oh, I'm going to write a novel about that summer, but from the chaperone's point of view. So that's what I set out to do. So it was a lot of research, but that's what I did with that one. Yes?
When Newsweek was still viable in a printed form, they'd ask someone who is a writer or is an informed citizen, what are the 6 best books that they've ever read? Do you have some like that?
Okay, I'm going to try it. The 6 best books I've ever read. That's hard, but I don't know. I'm going to do it. Okay, when I read this book, when I was writing this book, I read a book by Carl Sagan called The Demon Haunted World.
Oh, yeah.
And I love that book. I love that book because it's really about being rational and not giving into superstition or fear, but it's also really compassionate for people who haven't. There's no meanness, there's no intellectual snobbery in it, and it's I guess I'd call it wondrous atheism, wondrous agnosticism, and it's a very positive, uplifting book, and I admire him, not so much as an intellectual, but even more as a compassionate person. So I love that book, and then I read this book recently called Far from the Tree by Andrew Solomon, and he won the Pulitzer, I think, or the National Book Award for his previous book on depression. And it's a brick of a book. It's about 1,000 pages long, but Far from the Tree, he takes this idea that, he goes back, he starts with his own memoir. He's gay, and when he was growing up in the 60s, his parents were worried that he was going to have a terrible life. And so they tried to de-gay him. They tried really hard. They sent him to the camps and the schools. And he's very loving in his reminiscence of him because he understands that they just didn't want his life to be hard. They figured it's going to be harder for you if you can't stop this. And he was always trying to communicate to them, but I don't want to stop it. I know life is going to be harder for me, but just like, if it's harder to be African American, nobody says, well, I guess some people do say that, but you don't necessarily want to give up your blackness just because, you were proud of your identity. And so then he'd grown up thinking about this very logically. And then when he was working, I think, for the New Yorker, he was asked to do a story on the deaf community. And he went in and he was really surprised at this idea of deaf pride, that there were people in the deaf community who were so against cochlear implants. And he thought, why wouldn't you want to hear? Why would you want to make your life hard? And he kind of had that moment of, ah. And so then he goes into all these different communities of difference. He does people with autism, people with developmental delays, dwarfism. He does criminals, which is sort of interesting. He does children of rape. He does transgendered people. And it is the most fascinating, empathetic book I've read. And it's really, what he focuses on is this idea of a horizontal identity, when your identity has not come from your parents. And then also the parents' experience of bringing up a child that has such a huge difference from themselves, and how to relate and what that does to your life. So it's an interesting book to me as a parent, but it's really even more interesting to me as a human.
What was the book title?
It's called Far from the Tree.
And the author's name?
His name is Andrew Solomon. It's fantastic. It's a big book, but it's divided into sections, and it's just so brilliant. And at one point on the criminal section, he interviews the Kleboldts, with the parents of one of the Columbine killers. And it's probably one of the most beautiful, compassionate things I've ever read, because they were villainized. After that happened, everybody decided it must be their fault, and they must be terrible people. And he said they were some of the kindest people he'd ever known, and out of the hundreds and hundreds of people he interviewed and spent time with, he felt the most drawn to them and their humanity, which was surprising, and really, really moving. So let's see. I love, as fiction, I love the book Atonement by Ian McEwan. I love that book. I love Wild Swans, Three Daughters of China, because it told me all the stuff about Chinese history and how much people can endure and what they endure. And I made my students read it once, and I thought they were going to kill me because it's really long. It's all about China. Oh gosh, I'm going to forget one. Oh, I just read this book that I adore, and it's really about becoming a writer. My favorite writer, I think, is Tobias Wolff. I don't know if you've read him. He wrote This Boy's Life. He wrote a book about, he went to a prep school in the 60s, late 50s, early 60s. And so when he was at this school, much like Exeter, this sort of school where you either have to be really wealthy or really smart or both to even get in. And it's a funnel for the Ivy League schools. But when he was there, he really wanted to be a writer. And because this school had this really generous alumni association, they brought in 3 writers. They brought in Ernest Hemingway, they brought in Ayn Rand, and they brought in Robert Frost. And the students compete with each other to see who gets a private audience with each. And he dramatizes when each one comes to the school. And it's amazing. And you see this, I like him so much as a writer, so you really see him becoming the writer and sort of choosing what kind of writer and what kind of person he wants to be. But he's a very complicated man, but it's just such a look into the adolescence of a writer I admire so much. So I love that book. And
The name of the book, yeah.
it's called Old School. And it was the Read Across Kansas City book a couple years ago. It's just fantastic, and it's not big at all. So if the Far From the Tree sounds too scary, this is just like 190 pages. So I really love that book. I don't know. I don't want to go on and say any more, but
Margaret Atwood books?
oh, I love Margaret Atwood. Cat's Eye, my favorite, I think. I think she's amazing. I know I'm forgetting one. I love Sandra Cisneros, House on Mango Street, and that's really was inspirational for me to come up with this voice, because it's that present voice of a child who isn't necessarily super precocious, but at the same time insightful and poetic in her own way. So I love that book. I know I'm going to forget one later. Yes?
Practical question.
Okay.
Will these books be made available to the general public quite apart from the university for free?
I wish I knew. He asked me if the books would be made available to the general public aside from the university. I wish I knew. I guess I'm sorry I don't really know how the mechanism works yet.
Well, I had specifically asked whoever was in charge of your being here